The spring of 1823 came to Ashbourne Court, not as a season of renewal, but as a slow and patient collector, the kind who knows a debt will be paid in time, and is content to wait among the ruins until it is. It crept in through the cracked panes of the east wing, where the lead had buckled, and no one had the money to mend it. It pooled in the long gallery, where the portraits of dead Hales watched the damp climb their gilded frames, and said nothing, because the dead are always the last to admit that a house is dying. The great chimneys, which had once breathed warm smoke into the Derbyshire sky every morning of every winter for 200 years, now stood cold more often than not, for coal was dear, and the Hale fortune was a memory that the older servants spoke of the way they spoke of a kind master long buried. The house itself seemed to know. The honey-colored stone, which under a generous sun could still pretend to grandeur, had gone gray at the seams. Ivy had taken the south face entirely, and no one had ordered it cut, because to cut it would be to admit there was still something underneath worth showing. The fountain in the forecourt had not run in 6 years. A blackbird nested in its dry basin now, and that, the gardener said, was the only tenant Ashbourne had gained in a decade. Into this slow and dignified surrender walked Margaret Hale, 24 years of age, with a basket of cut nettles over one arm, and the hem of her gray dress dark with morning dew. She was the practical one. That was how the household named her, when they named her at all, and they did not name her often, for there was a prettier Hale to look at. Margaret had brown hair that she pinned without much ceremony, hands that were never quite clean because they were always at work, and a way of looking at a broken thing as though it were merely a problem that had not yet been spoken to firmly enough. Her gown was gray, and had been gray before her, for it had belonged first to her mother, and been turned and let out and taken in across 3 bodies in 20 years. Dove gray, charcoal at the cuffs, where the dye had given up. The colors of survival, an aunt had once called such gowns, and Margaret had thought it a fine phrase, and never repeated it, because she did not believe a person ought to dress up their own poverty in pretty words. The nettles were for soup. There was a recipe of her grandmother's written in a hand gone brown that turned spring nettles and a heel of bacon into something that could feed the kitchen for 2 days. And Margaret had made it so often that her fingers no longer minded the sting. She gathered them at the wood's edge each morning before her sister woke, because her sister did not need to know how thin the larder had gone, and because the morning was the only hour at Ashbourne that still belonged to no one. Her sister was Cecily. Cecily was 19, golden-haired, and beautiful, in the way that made strangers in church turn around in their pews to be sure they had seen it. Cecily did not gather nettles. Cecily was being saved, the way one saves the last good candle. For the moment the family would need her most, and everyone at Ashbourne understood without saying it that Cecily's face was the last unspent coin the Hales possessed. Their father, Sir Edmund Hale, understood it best of all. He was a baronet, which is to say a gentleman with a title old enough to be proud of, and an income too small to support the pride. He had spent the better part of Margaret's childhood selling. The lower meadow first, then the mill, then the silver, then the horses, then the silver again when somehow there had still been a little left to find. What remained was the house, the name, and his 2 daughters. And of those 3, only the daughters had not yet begun to leak money. Sir Edmund loved them both in the distracted way of a father who loved chiefly his own grief, and he had decided that spring that the time had come to convert at least one of them into rescue. The rescue had a name, and the name was the Duke of Wexford. Margaret heard it first from the open window of her father's study, where she had gone to leave the morning's letters and stayed, against her better nature, to listen. Sir Edmund was speaking to the steward, an old man named Pruitt, who had stayed on for half his wages because he had nowhere else to be old. "He comes Thursday," Sir Edmund said. "The Duke comes Thursday, Pruitt, and we will receive him as though Ashbourne were what it was. Do you understand me?" "With what, Sir Edmund?" "With Cecily," her father said, and there was no cruelty in it, only arithmetic. "We will receive him with Cecily." Margaret set the letters down very quietly and went out to feed the hens. She knew of the Duke of Wexford the way everyone in the county knew of him, which was to say she knew the rumors and none of the man. He was rich past sense, a great estate over in the next county, falcons and stables, and a name that opened every door in England. He was unmarried at 33, which the county found suspicious, and he was said to be cold. A widower, some claimed, though no one could produce the widow. Proud, certainly. He had refused 3 perfectly good matches in 2 years, and a man who refuses 3 good matches is either a fool or a man looking for something he has not yet been shown. And the county had long since decided he was a fool, because that was the more comfortable conclusion. What the county did not know, because the Duke had taken some care that they should not, was that Henry Vane, 8th Duke of Wexford, had grown very tired of being married for his money. Every house he entered arranged its daughters in front of him like plates set out for a feast. Every smile he received had a sum behind it. He had begun, in the privacy of a mind he showed no one, to wonder whether there was a single woman in England who would look at him and see a man rather than an estate, and he had concluded, with the bitterness of one who has tested the question too often, that there was not. And so before he ever set foot in Ashbourne Court as its honored guest, he came as something else entirely. He came on a Tuesday, 2 days before he was expected, on a plain bay horse, in a coat that had seen weather, with mud to the knee and 3 days of beard. And he presented himself at the kitchen door of Ashbourne Court as a man named Tom Vane, who had heard the Gardens wanted hands. The Gardens did want hands. The Gardens had wanted hands for years and not been able to pay for them. But the man called Tom offered to work the spring planting for his board in a corner of the loft. And Pruitt, who could not turn away free labor when the Duke himself was coming Thursday, and the forecourt looked like a churchyard, took him on without a single useful question. It was Margaret who showed him the Gardens. She did it grudgingly, because she had nettle soup on the fire, and a sister to dress and a house to make presentable for a man who would decide their futures. And she had no hour to spare for a vagabond gardener. But Pruitt was lame, and her father was in his study practicing dignity. So it fell to her, as nearly everything at Ashbourne fell to her, and she took him out through the kitchen garden with a brisk step and no welcome. "The walled garden's gone to bramble," she said. "The glass house lost its panes in the storm 2 winters back, and we hadn't the glass to mend it. The orchard wants pruning, and no one's pruned it since the last man left, which was before my father stopped paying men to leave. If you've come expecting an easy place, you've come wrong." "I've not come expecting an easy place," said the man called Tom. "Good," said Margaret. "Then Then you'll not be disappointed." He looked at her then, and she felt it, the look, the particular weight of a man taking proper measure of a person, and she turned and gave him the rake before he could finish, because she had been measured by men before, and it had never once been to her advantage. "The bed's along the south wall," she said. "If you can have them turned by Thursday, you'll have earned your loft. There's a gentleman coming Thursday, and my father would like the place not to look as though it's been abandoned by God, which it has." "And has it," said Tom, "been abandoned?" Margaret stopped. It was an impertinent question from a gardener, and she ought to have told him so. Instead, she found herself answering it, because it was the first honest question anyone had asked her in a very long time. "Houses aren't abandoned," she said. "People are. The house just stands here being innocent while the people inside it run out of ways to pretend." And then, because she had said more than she meant to a stranger with mud on his boots, she added, "Turn the beds. There's bread at noon if cook remembers you." And she went back to her nettles. The man called Tom turned the beds. He turned them well, which surprised her, for she had not expected competence from a man who arrived on a tired horse, asking after work. She watched him from the kitchen window the first morning between stirring the soup and skimming it, and what she saw was not the labor of a man working for his board, but the patience of someone who knew soil. He did not hack at the south beds the way the last hired man had, turning the top and leaving the dead clay beneath. He went down a full spade's depth and broke each clod against the edge of the blade, and stooped to pull the bindweed roots out entire rather than chopping them, which any gardener will tell you only plants the bindweed deeper. He worked without hurry and without rest, and by noon he had done what the last man had been paid a week to leave, half finished. And Margaret, skimming her soup, found herself unaccountably annoyed because she did not like to be surprised, and a competent vagabond was a thing she had no shelf to put away on. At noon she took him bread because cook had not remembered him, and Margaret had learned long ago that the things cook did not remember fell, like everything else, to her. She set it on the wall beside him without a word and turned to go. "The clay's sour," he said to her back, "along the bottom of these beds. You've a spring under the south wall that's never been drained, and it's drowning your roots every wet spring and breaking your hearts every dry one. Dig a trench of rubble to the ditch, and you'll have the best beds in the county. Whoever laid this garden out put the kitchen plot in the wettest corner of the whole estate." "My great-grandfather laid it out," said Margaret. "Then your great-grandfather," said Tom, breaking the bread, "was a fool about drainage, and I'd have told him so." Margaret stood with the empty basket against her hip and discovered to her great irritation that she wanted to laugh, and that she could not remember the last time a thing a stranger said had made her want to. He was a fool about a great many things, she allowed. Drainage was the least of them. He sold the lower meadow to a man who flooded it on purpose and turned it into a carp pond, and then bought the carp back at market every Friday for the rest of his life and called it a bargain. She let one corner of her mouth go up. "Dig your trench if you've the time before Thursday. There's rubble enough in the old dairy. God knows we've fallen down. Enough of our own buildings to drain a parish." He dug the trench. He turned the bed so well that by the second day Pruitt had stopped watching him, and by the third, the under-gardener, a boy of 14 named Wick, had begun to follow him about like a duckling. And Tom had begun, in the slow, unhurried way of someone who has decided to stay a while, to mend the things that had been broken at Ashbourne so long that no one any longer saw them as broken. He mended the gate of the kitchen garden, which had hung from one hinge since before Margaret could remember. She came out at dusk to find him standing back from it, and he swung it twice on the new pin to show her, and it moved without the shriek it had made all her life. And the silence where the shriek had been was so strange that she stopped on the path. "It's quiet," she said stupidly. "It was the hinge, not the gate," said Tom. "It usually is. People replace the whole gate when it's only ever the hinge. The pin had worn to a wafer. I cut one from a barrow spoke in the old dairy. It's the wrong size, too long by half an inch. But it'll hold 10 years if no one fusses it." He looked at the gate and then briefly at her. Things hang crooked a long time before anyone thinks to look at what they're actually hanging from. "That's a great deal of philosophy for a gate," said Margaret. "It's a great deal of gate," said Tom, "to have hung crooked 11 years. And she did not have an answer to that. So she went in and minded the soup, and did not tell him that she had counted, and that it was 11 years exactly, and that she was unsettled to find a stranger had counted too. He set a frame of old sash over the worst gap in the glass house, so that at least the seedlings would not freeze. And on the third evening, when the light went long and gold across the forecourt, and Margaret came out to throw the dishwater on the rose roots, because water cost nothing and roses cost everything, she found him standing perfectly still by the dry fountain with his arm held out, and on his arm, white as altar linen and entirely impossible, sat a falcon. Margaret stopped with the basin against her hip. She knew falcons the way she knew most fine things, which was to say from a distance and never her own. This one was a her falcon, white as winter, with eyes the cold dark of a frozen well, the sort of bird that belonged on the wrist of a king, and not on the arm of a gardener in a borrowed loft at a dying house. It should not have been there at all, and it sat on Tom's arm with its wings folded and its head tipped, watching Margaret across the forecourt with an attention that made the hair rise along her arms. "That isn't yours," she said. "No," said Tom after a moment. "She isn't. She belongs to a man I know. She flew ahead of him, and I'd not be surprised if he's hunting the county for her by now." "Then you ought to send word." "I ought," he agreed, and did not move to. The falcon shifted her weight, and then, with a thing like deliberation, she opened her wings, lifted from Tom's arm in a single soft beat that Margaret felt against her face like the turning of a heavy page, crossed the forecourt, and settled on the rim of the dishwater basin not a foot from Margaret's hand. Margaret did not move. One does not move with a bird like that within reach of one's eyes. She stood with the basin against her hip and the falcon on its rim, and the white bird turned its frozen well eyes on her and considered her with the flat, unhurried interest of a creature that has never once in its life been impressed by a title. "She'll not hurt you," said Tom. And there was something new in his voice, something he had not meant to put there. "She doesn't go to people. She doesn't go to anyone." "She's gone to me," said Margaret. "Yes," said the man called Tom, very quietly watching the two of them across the gold evening light. "She has." Margaret set down the basin slowly and held out the back of her hand, because it seemed rude to do otherwise to a guest so finely dressed. And the falcon stepped onto her wrist, as though Margaret's wrist were a thing she had been promised. The weight of her was startling, dense and warm and entirely alive. And Margaret stood in the ruin of her family's forecourt with a king's bird on her arm, and her gray sleeve, dark at the cuff, and for the length of perhaps 10 breaths, she forgot to be tired. "What is she called?" Margaret asked. "Sleet," said Tom. "That's a cold name for a warm thing." "She was named by a cold man," said Tom, and looked away. It was Cecily who broke it. Cecily came out onto the steps in her one good muslin, calling for Margaret to come and help with her hair, and the Falcon went up off Margaret's wrist in a clean white rush and crossed back to Tom's arm, and the evening folded itself back into what it had been, and Margaret carried the empty basin in and said nothing to anyone, because there are some hours a practical person knows to keep. Thursday came. The Duke of Wexford was expected at 4. At 3, Margaret had Cecily dressed, and the small parlor swept, and the one good tea service, which had not been sold, only because a corner of it was chipped, and no one would buy a chipped service, set out on the one good cloth. At 3:30, Sir Edmund came down in his coat from better years, and stood in the hall practicing the welcome he had composed. At 4, no one came. At 5, no one came. At 6, as the light went and the candles were lit, 2 to a room, to save the tallow, Sir Edmund sat in the small parlor with his cold tea and his beautiful unspent daughter, and understood, slowly, that the Duke of Wexford was not coming, and that he had been judged not worth the journey, and that the county had been right about him all along. Margaret found her father there at 7, in the dark, with the candle guttering. "He'll have had a better invitation," Sir Edmund said. He did not look at her. "A man like that. A better house. I should not have hoped. It was vanity to hope." "It was sense," said Margaret, because it had been in its way. "You did the arithmetic. The arithmetic was sound. It's the world that doesn't add." "You're a hard girl, Margaret." "I'm a tired one," she said. "There's a difference, though. I'll grant you it's hard to see from the outside." And she took the cold tea away to be saved for the morning, because in a house like Ashbourne, even cold tea was not thrown out. She went out to the forecourt because she could not sleep, and the kitchen was full of her father's silence. And she found the man called Tom there, in the dark, sitting on the dry rim of the fountain with the white falcon hooded on his fist. And he was looking at the lit windows of the small parlor with an expression she could not read in the dark. "You're up late for a gardener," she said. "I am," he said. She sat down on the cold stone a little apart from him, because she was too tired to stand on ceremony with a man who turned beds for his board, and for a while neither of them spoke, and the falcon shifted under its hood, and the house breathed its damp around them. "The gentleman didn't come," Margaret said at last. "The one my father waited for, the Duke. We made the place fine for him, and he didn't come, and my father sitting in there in his good coat being measured by a man who never arrived." She found, to her own surprise, that she was angry. "Do you know what's cruel, Tom? Not the coming. Not the looking us over and finding us wanting. I'd have stood that. We'd have all stood that. What's cruel is being weighed by a man too proud to put himself on the scale. To be found not worth the trouble of judging. That's the cruelty. That's the one that has my father sitting in the dark." The man called Tom was very still. "Perhaps," he said slowly, "the gentleman had reasons." "Everyone with money has reasons," said Margaret. "That's what money buys. The rest of us just have to manage." She stood and brushed the damp stone from her gray skirt. "Good night. Mind the seedlings. There'll be frost yet." She had reached the kitchen door when his voice came after her across the dark forecourt, lower than she had heard it. "Why Nettles?" he said. She turned. "What?" "You gather nettles," said Tom, "before light, every morning. A girl whose father is a baronet, gathering nettles at the wood's edge at dawn so that no one will see." "Why?" For a long moment Margaret stood in the doorway, with the warm kitchen light behind her, and she thought about lying, because lying was easier and the truth was nobody's business, and certainly not a gardener's. But she was tired, and the dark made a kind of confessional of the forecourt, and so she told him. "Because my sister doesn't need to know how little there is," she said. "Because my father has sold everything a man can sell that isn't a daughter, and the only thing left in this house worth selling is Cecily's face, and I would rather gather nettles in the wood every morning of my life than have her find out she's the last thing we own. Nettles make soup. Soup is free if you don't mind the sting, and I don't mind the sting." She lifted her chin. "Good night, Tom." She went in and shut the door, and did not see the man on the fountain rim sit a long time in the dark afterward, with the white Falcon on his fist, looking at the closed kitchen door of a dying house, as though he had at last, after years of looking, found the thing he had stopped believing was real. He left before dawn. Margaret knew it because the south beds were finished, all of them, turned and raked and edged, as fine as any garden in the county, and the loft was empty, and the bay horse was gone from the stable, and there was no man called Tom anywhere at Ashbourne Court. Pruitt grumbled that a gardener who left without his last day's bread was no gardener at all, and the under gardener was inconsolable. And Margaret said nothing, because she had learned long ago that the things that leave Ashbourne do not come back, and a person saves herself a world of grief by not waiting for them. She did not say that she had gone out to the forecourt at first light and found one white feather on the rim of the dry fountain, and that she had put it in the pocket of her gray gown and not told a soul. A fortnight passed. It was Pruitt who brought the letter, on a salver, because some habits outlive the fortune that made them sensible, and Sir Edmund opened it at the breakfast table with hands that shook, because letters at Ashbourne were never good news anymore, only the same bad news in fresh ink. But this letter was not a demand for money. It was an invitation. The Duke of Wexford, it said, in a clerk's fine hand, presented his compliments to Sir Edmund Hale, and regretted most sincerely the misunderstanding that had prevented his attendance upon the appointed day. He hoped to make amends. He would be honored if Sir Edmund and his daughters would dine at Wexford Hall on the last Thursday of the month, where a small company would be gathered, and where the Duke wished particularly to make the acquaintance of Sir Edmund's family. Sir Edmund read it 3 times. Then he laughed, a sound Margaret had not heard from her father in a year, and called for Cecily, and the house came alive with a desperate, fragile hope, because a second chance at the Duke of Wexford was more than Sir Edmund had dared pray for, and a man clutches a second chance the harder for having grieved the first. There was the question of dress, of course. There was always in that house the question of dress, which was the polite name for the question of money. Cecily would have the muslin, made over with a new sash bought on credit Margaret did not know how they would repay, and Margaret would have her gray. "You'll want something better than the gray," Cecily said, not unkindly, brushing out her golden hair before the speckled glass. "It's a duke's house, Meg. There'll be silk on every back in the room." "Then I'll be the one back without it," said Margaret, "and they'll have something to talk of." "I'm not going to be looked at, Cecily. I'm going to mind that you are." She pinned her sister's hair and did not say that the gray was the only gown she owned that did not show a mend, and that a woman learns to call a necessity a choice, because it is the only dignity poverty leaves her. But she took the white feather from the pocket of her old gray gown and pinned it inside the collar of the one she would wear, against her throat where no one would see it, because it was the one fine thing she owned, and because she did not entirely know why. And a practical person distrusts the things she cannot explain and keeps them close all the same. Wexford Hall was everything Ashbourne had once dreamed of being and could no longer remember how to be. It rose out of its park like a thing that had never doubted itself. Every window lit, the gravel raked, footmen on the steps in livery that cost more than the Hale carriage and the horse that drew it together. Margaret helped her father down and steadied Cecily's nerve with a hand at her back, and walked into a hall the size of Ashbourne's whole east wing with her chin level and her gray skirts plain among the silks. And she felt the looks come, the quick downward flick of eyes that priced a gown in a glance and dismissed the woman wearing it. And she bore them, because she had been bearing them all her life and had long ago stopped letting them land where they were aimed. There was a company, as the letter had promised. 12 fine people, and at the heart of them, holding the room the way a hearth holds a cold evening, a woman. Her name was Lady Sabrina Croft, and she was the sort of beauty that is also a strategy. Golden like Cecily, but where Cecily's beauty was an accident she carried apologetically, Lady Sabrina's was a weapon she had spent years learning to aim. She had 10,000 a year and a profile struck on a coin and an understanding, shared by all the county, that she would be the next Duchess of Wexford the moment the Duke came to his senses, which the county felt he was overdue to do. She stood near the great fireplace and received the Hales the way a queen receives a delegation from a province she intends to tax. "Sir Edmund," she said, "and these will be the daughters. How charming." Her eyes went over Cecily and warmed a degree at the competition and went over Margaret and cooled to nothing. "And one of you in mourning, I see. My condolences. Or is it only the gown?" "Only the gown, my lady," said Margaret pleasantly. "I find it wears well and asks nothing of me. I found that a great convenience in a garment." Something flickered behind Lady Sabrina's lovely eyes, the small irritation of a hand that has slapped and found no cheek. "How practical," she said, making the word a small wound. "So I'm told," said Margaret, "and often." "Hale?" said Lady Sabrina, turning the name over as though she were checking it for cracks. "Hale of Ashbourne, I do know the name. My father bought your lower meadow, I think, years ago, or was it the mill? One forgets which parcel was which once a family begins to sell. It must be a singular education, Miss Hale, watching one's inheritance leave the house a field at a time. I confess I cannot imagine it. We have always rather added to ours." "It is an education, my lady," Margaret agreed, "though I think you'd find adding teaches a person less than losing does. Anyone can learn the worth of a thing by buying it. It takes rather more attention to learn it by watching it go." She inclined her head and turned to admire the fireplace, because she had learned that the surest way to disarm a cruel woman is to decline to be wounded, and that nothing enrages a person who fights with insult quite so much as an opponent who will not bleed. A stout gentleman near the window, who had been listening with the frank enjoyment of a man at a cockfight, laughed aloud before he could stop himself, and then disguised it badly as a cough, and Lady Sabrina's eyes went to him cold as a closing door, and he found something fascinating to study in the bottom of his glass. The exchange was noted. In a county where nothing ever happened, an exchange like that was very nearly an event, and it traveled the room in murmurs the way a crack travels a frozen pond, quietly and in every direction at once. The Duke had not yet come down. They waited. The company moved and murmured. Lady Sabrina held court. Sir Edmund stood, with his second chance hope shining off him so plainly that Margaret had to look away, because she loved him and could not bear how nakedly he wanted this. And Cecily stood beautiful and terrified at her father's elbow, doing the one thing she had been raised to do, which was to be looked at, and being looked at, and bearing it. And then a door opened at the head of the great stair, and a footman said, in the voice they keep for it, His Grace the Duke of Wexford. And the company turned as one, and the Duke came down the stairs. Margaret knew him before he reached the bottom step. She knew him though the mud was gone, and the beard was gone, and the borrowed coat was gone. Though he was dressed now in dark blue, that fit him the way money fits a man born to it. Though he came down those stairs with the unhurried certainty of a man who has never in his life been asked to turn a flower bed for his bread. She knew the set of his shoulders. She knew the particular weight of his attention as it crossed the room, because it had crossed her once before in a kitchen garden, over a rake. She knew the man called Tom, who had mended the gate that had hung broken half her life. And her hand went without her leave to the collar of her gray gown, to the place where a white feather lay hidden against her throat, and her heart did something complicated and unwelcome that she did not have a word for and would not have used the word if she had. And on his fist, hooded in fine blue leather worked with silver white as altar linen, sat the falcon called Sleet. The Duke reached the bottom of the stairs. The company bowed and curtsied in its rustling wave. He acknowledged them with the small grave courtesy of a man performing a duty, and his eyes moved across the room, across the silks and the profiles and the 10,000 a year, across Lady Sabrina Croft, who had arranged herself by the fire to be discovered, and his eyes did not stop. They stopped on a gray gown. Sir Edmund Hale, said the Duke of Wexford, and crossed the room, and the company turned to follow him, and Lady Sabrina's smile held its shape by main force. You are most welcome. I owe you an apology I mean to pay in full this evening, and these are your daughters. They are, your grace. Sir Edmund's voice nearly broke on it. May I present my elder daughter, Margaret, and my younger Cecily. The Duke bowed to Cecily, who was beautiful, and who curtsied beautifully, and whom he looked at with perfect courtesy, and not one flicker of the thing the whole room had assembled to witness. And then he turned to Margaret in her gray gown, with a king's falcon on his fist, and he looked at her exactly as he had looked at her across a rake in a dying garden. And Margaret looked back at him and declined, with the whole of her considerable will, to faint, to flush, to flee, or to give the watching room the satisfaction of a single thing it could repeat. Miss Hale, said the Duke. Your Grace, said Margaret. I see your bird came home. A silence went through the company like a draught. It was not the thing one said. One did not, on being presented to a duke, remark upon his falcon as though one had met it. Lady Sabrina's lovely brows drew the smallest distance together. She did, said the Duke, and there was, beneath the gravity, the ghost of something else. Though she's been restless since, she acquired, I'm told, a taste for poorer company than mine, and has not been satisfied with my fist since she found it. Birds have sense, your grace, said Margaret. It's their chief advantage over people. And the falcon, as though it had only been waiting to be spoken of, lifted its hooded head and baited against the jesses, wings cracking open, straining off the Duke's fist toward the gray gown, and the Duke did not check her. He raised his fist and slipped the braces of the hood and drew it free, and the white falcon's frozen well eyes found Margaret across the bright, crowded room. And she went. She crossed the great hall of Wexford in a single low white rush over the heads of the finest company in the county, scattering a gasp before her, and she settled on the wrist of Margaret Hale's gray gown, as though that wrist were a thing she had been promised, and folded her wings, and was still. No one breathed. Margaret stood in the center of Wexford Hall with a king's bird on her arm, and her plain gray sleeve and the white feather hidden at her throat. And she did not look at the company, and she did not look at Lady Sabrina Croft, who had gone the color of the ash in the great grate. She looked at the Duke. "You'll want her back?" Margaret said quietly. "No," said the Duke of Wexford. "I don't believe I will." It was Lady Sabrina who could not let it stand, a woman who has spent years aiming her beauty at a single target, cannot watch the target choose, in front of the entire county, a girl in a borrowed gray gown, and say nothing. She came forward in a rustle of silk, and her smile was a beautiful thing with a blade folded inside it. "So extraordinary," she said light, carrying for the room. "But then the lower creatures do gravitate to their own level, do they not? A kitchen bird to a kitchen gown. One hears, Miss Hale, that you gather your own greens at Ashbourne, from the hedgerows, like a cottager's wife. A ripple of uncertain laughter, the laughter of people who do not know yet which way to laugh. I do think it's charming, truly. There's no shame in poverty, only in pretending to be what one is not." She let her eyes travel slow and cruel down the gray gown. "And you wear it so honestly." The room waited for Margaret Hale to break. It was what the room had assembled half of it to see: the plain girl in gray, put in her place by the golden woman in silk, the natural order restored, everyone home by 10 with a story. Sir Edmund had gone white. Cecily had reached for her sister's free hand, and Margaret stood with a Duke's falcon on her arm and looked at Lady Sabrina Croft, and did not break, and did not blush, and did not strike back, because she had learned the one thing that women like Lady Sabrina never learn, which is that the surest answer to cruelty is to refuse it the dignity of a wound. "You're quite right, my lady," Margaret said. Her voice was level, and it carried because she did not raise it, and a room will lean in to hear a quiet voice it expected to hear shake. "I do gather greens from the hedgerows, with my own hands, before light, so my sister needn't know how little there is at home, because I'd rather she keep her good opinion of the world a year or two longer than I kept mine. There's no shame in it, as you say. There's nettle soup in it, which is a good deal more useful than shame. A breath. You're right, too, that the only disgrace is in pretending to be what one is not. I've never pretended, my lady. I haven't the wardrobe for it. I am exactly what you see, a poor man's practical daughter in her mother's made-over gown, who feeds her household on what grows free and asks the world for nothing, because the world has made it very plain it has nothing to spare for me." She inclined her head, courteous, unbroken. "I'm only surprised you'd think it an insult. Where I come from, we call it managing, and we're rather proud of it. The silence after held a different shape. It is one thing to humiliate a girl who weeps. It is another thing entirely to insult a woman who agrees with you, calmly, completely, and turns your every blade into a thing she is quietly proud of, so that the cruelty has nowhere to land and rebounds, slow and terrible, onto the one who flung it. Lady Sabrina Croft stood in the center of the company she had ruled an hour before, and felt the room turn under her feet, felt it tilt. The small involuntary recalculation of a dozen fine people deciding all at once and against their habit that the gray gown had more in it than the silk. "How very," said Lady Sabrina, and could not find the end of the sentence. "Practical," Margaret offered. "Yes," said the Duke of Wexford into the silence, and the whole room turned to him, for they had forgotten, in the small bright war of the two women, that the man they were all there for had been standing all the while, watching. He was not looking at Lady Sabrina. He was looking at Margaret Hale, and he watched her with the open, undefended face of a man who has spent years building a wall against exactly this, and discovered, too late to do anything sensible about it, that the wall has fallen down. Yes, practical and brave, which is rarer, and honest, which is rarer still, and not for sale, which... And here for the first time the Duke of Wexford smiled, and it changed his cold face entirely. "Which is, I have found, the rarest thing in England, and the only thing I have ever wanted and I had begun to believe did not exist." He turned to the room. "I owe this company an explanation," he said, "and the Hales an apology, and I find the two are the same story, so you shall have it together. I did not fail to come to Ashbourne Court. I came 2 days early, and I came as a gardener, with mud on my boots, and another man's name, because I am very rich and very tired, and a rich, tired man learns to doubt every smile aimed at him, and I had resolved to see just once how a household treats a man who can do nothing for it." His eyes went to Sir Edmund and softened. "Forgive me, sir. It was not honest, and you have my apology. But I will tell you what I found at Ashbourne. I found a house with no money and a great deal of dignity. I found a baronet too proud to let his second daughter see the bottom of the larder. And I found a woman in a gray gown, gathering nettles in the wood before light, who spoke to a vagabond gardener as though he were a man and not a purse, and who told me, not knowing who I was, with nothing to gain by it, that the cruelest thing in the world is to be weighed by someone too proud to put himself on the scale." He paused. "She was right, and I have been that man for years. So I put myself on the scale. I came back as a gardener, and she fed me and corrected me and never once tried to be more than she was. And my Falcon, who has not gone willingly to a stranger in the 4 years I've owned her, left my fist for her wrist in a dying forecourt and wouldn't be argued out of it." He looked at the white bird, folded calm on Margaret's gray sleeve. "I have learned to trust the bird's judgment over my own. She saw it before I would let myself." He crossed to Margaret. The company parted for him. Lady Sabrina Croft stood by the fire she no longer ruled, and was for perhaps the first time in her gilded life entirely unregarded. "Miss Hale," said the Duke of Wexford low now, for her and not the room, "I came to your father's house to test a household, and I was the one weighed and found wanting, and you did the weighing without ever knowing you held the scale. I have no right to ask you anything. You owe me less than nothing. You owe me a scolding for the deceit. but I find I cannot go back to being the man I was before a girl in a gray gown told me the truth in the dark." He paused. "I am not asking you to marry a duke. I know better than that now, than to think the title would weigh with you. I am asking whether you might consider a man named Tom, who turned your south beds and mended your gate, and would very much like permission to mend the rest of Ashbourne Court, and to bring his Falcon, who's plainly already chosen and who will not forgive me if I bungle this. And Margaret Hale, 24, in her mother's made-over gray gown, with a white feather hidden at her throat, and a king's falcon on her wrist, and the whole astonished county watching, looked at the Duke of Wexford for a long moment, and did the practical thing, which was for once in her careful life also the thing she wanted. "The gate stuck for 11 years, she said. "My father never could find the money for the hinge. You mended it in an afternoon with the wrong size pin, and it hasn't stuck since." Her voice was not quite steady, and she let it not be, because there is a kind of honesty that is braver than composure. "I noticed, Tom. I noticed a man who mended a broken thing simply because it was broken and he could, and asked nothing for it. There's not been much of that at Ashbourne. There's not been much of it in my life at all." She looked down at the falcon, white and certain on her gray sleeve, and then up at the man who had named it. "I'll consider the gardener," said Margaret Hale. "I find I never had any quarrel with the gardener. It's only the Duke I'll want some convincing about, and I expect you'll have the rest of your life to manage it." "I should like nothing better," said the Duke of Wexford, "than the rest of my life to manage it." They were married at the small church near Ashbourne, where Margaret had sat all her life in the second-best pew, in the early autumn of that same year. And the county came, all of it, the ones who had priced her gown in a glance, and the ones who had laughed the uncertain laugh. And they watched a girl they had overlooked for 24 years walk up the aisle in gray, for she would not be married in anything else. And the Duke had said gray was the color he had fallen in love with, and would not hear of another and become the Duchess of Wexford. And there was not one of them who had seen it coming, and there was not one of them afterward who would admit to it. Lady Sabrina Croft did not come. She had gone to Bath for the season, the county said, and married the following spring, a viscount with a fortune of his own and a profile struck on no coin at all, and was, by every account, exactly as happy as a woman is who has spent her life learning to aim her beauty and finally hit a target worth precisely what she paid for it. Sir Edmund Hale lived to see Ashbourne Court mended. The Duke saw to it quietly the way he had mended the gate, the chimneys breathing smoke again, the glass house glazed, the fountain running for the first time in 7 years, the blackbird relocated, the undergardener kept on at a proper wage, and very proud. Sir Edmund never quite stopped being a man who had loved chiefly his own grief, but he learned in his last years to love his daughters out loud, which Margaret counted the greatest mending of all, and the only one the money had nothing to do with. Cecily married a clergyman she chose herself 3 years later, for no better reason than that he made her laugh, and was permitted to, because the family no longer needed her face to be its last good coin. And a girl who is not the last thing a house owns is free, it turns out, to be merely happy. And Margaret, Duchess of Wexford, kept her gray gowns. She had silk enough now to drown in, and she wore the silk when the occasion asked it. But in the early mornings, when the great house slept, She would put on the gray and go out into the gardens she had once been too poor to keep, and the white falcon would come down off the dovecote to her wrist without being called, and the two of them would walk the dew-dark beds in the first light, the practical woman and the bird who had chosen her, and no one watching and nothing to prove, and the colors of survival worn now, not against the cold, but for the comfort of remembering exactly who she had always been. She kept the feather too, the first one from the rim of the dry fountain at Ashbourne, on the morning the gardener left. She kept it in a small box on the table by her bed, and her husband never asked her why, because by then he understood that a practical person keeps the one thing she cannot explain closest of all, and that this, in the end, was the truest thing she'd ever told him without a single word. Thank you for listening to this story all the way to the end. If it warmed you even a little, please tell us in the comments which city or town you are listening from and what the story made you feel. We read every one, and there is nothing we love more than imagining all of you out there in the quiet of the evening. If you would like more stories like this one, slow and gentle and kind, please subscribe so that the next time the velvet hour comes around, we will be here waiting for you. Sleep well and be gentle with yourself. We will see you in the next story.